Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue covering the games from the Arco, Città di Arco Chess Open. In round 3, after one win and one loss, I faced a 1700 rated opponent, which is never easy. It's never easy to face lower rated opponents. I just want to comment on a comment I got on a video I recorded a few days ago, where I said it's hard to play lower rated players. By that, I did not mean anything disrespectful towards lower-rated players. Actually, it's praise for lower-rated players. I mean, the psychological advantage is always on your side when you have a lower rating, because your opponent has something to prove, and you can safely play for a draw. You can safely wait for your opponent to push. And if you're content with the draw, you don't have to create any chances. So I did not mean anything disrespectful towards lower-rated players. Quite the contrary. I enjoy being the lower-rated player when playing a tournament game. In any case, my opponent is about 200 points lower-rated than I am in this game. He's a young player. Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact age, maybe 13, 14, 15, something like that. I played d4. In round 1, I went for e4, now I went d4. Since I play both now, I actually am struggling to decide which one I would like to play. Okay, knight f6. And for my opponent, I've been preparing in detail, because he always plays very aggressive Benoni-type setups with knight f6, c5. And I caught, I found a mistake in his repertoire, which I actually got to play in this game. And this is quite interesting if you play the London system against these very aggressive setups. So in order to avoid early queen b6 nonsense and those variations which could end in a draw with, for example, bishop f4, c5, e3, queen b6, and knight c3, there are some lines in which black could draw very early on after queen takes b2 and knight b5. I don't know whether my opponent knew that well or not, but I didn't want to risk a drawn game. So a good move order against knight f6, c5 setup is actually to start with knight f3. Now after c5, you don't have to go e3. You can go c3. And this is a subtlety that sort of gets knight f6, c5 players out of their comfort zone, I would say. Obviously now queen b6 does nothing because my bishop is still on c1. And he wants to play a dragon sort of setup with g6. So he went g6, and now I go bishop f4. And the variations are not the same. If queen b6, now queen b3 is actually a good move. So bishop to g7, excuse me, e6. And now there are 3 good moves in this position. There are 5 moves which have been played. 2 of them are simply bad. My opponent actually played 2 of those bad moves in his previous games. So the good moves are b6, which is, I think, the best move. You want your bishop on b7. Queen b6 is also okay. And you can also go cd4. My opponent in his previous games played either d6 or castles. Both of these are very bad. And even though they seem like the most normal moves, they simply don't work. After d6, obviously white can just take. And takes, king takes queen, and it's not a winning advantage, but this is an extremely pleasant position for white to play. It's a Caro-Kann or Scandi setup with a bishop outside of the pawn chain. The king is misplaced. You can safely castle queenside, and they're actually targets. You can go knight e5 straight away or knight g5. The other move which he played in this position, he played in this game, and that's castles. And against castles, you can actually just win a pawn. This may seem like a Reti sort of Catalan in reverse without d5. And in those positions, usually d takes c is a bad move, giving up the center. In this exact position, it's actually the best move. And this was my preparation. This has been played about 10 times in tournament games. And whatever black does in this position, he just loses the pawn. Queen a5 doesn't work. I can safely go b4. The most obvious move, knight e4, which is a Catalan or Reti type move, simply fails to queen d5, and the knight has no squares. All of these squares are covered, so the knight has to go back to f6, and now simply queen to b3. And if they try knight e4 again, then queen to b4, and your pawn is defended, so you keep your extra pawn. So after dc5, he thought for a long time, and in the end played knight c6, which has to be the best move. I mean, you gave up a pawn, at least develop your pieces. I developed normally bishop e2, knight h5, I'm not giving up my bishop, so bishop g5, and b6. The pawn cannot be regained, so he may as well develop either his queen or activate his rook. So I took, I'm not giving the pawn back. Queen takes b6, and now queen to b3. Obviously, I would love a queen trade. He went rook to b8, and now I played a move which I knew wasn't good. That may sound funny. The move I thought was good left the position on the board very unclear. So obviously the move you would like to play here is knight b to d2. That has to be the best move, and I was aware of that, but I just didn't want to go into so many complications after this. So black, if he goes queen takes queen, then this is easy. This is such a clean pawn up, and knight d4 to follow, misplacing this one and maybe taking on a7. But the problem is after knight bd2, he has h6. And my bishop has to go to h4. Now he plays queen to c7. My queen has to move again, and now d5. And with bishop f5 coming, this seemed really uncomfortable. I thought I was going to give the pawn back in the end. I'd been calculating this for a long time during the game, and it wasn't even about calculation, it was about his pieces being too active. So after rook b8, I played a suboptimal move. I took the queen. And after rook takes b6, I played b3. Now, obviously, this pawn is a huge weakness. Knight b4 is coming with knight c2 threats. And this is risky as well. But I calculated all the variations, and I took all the tactical patterns he could go for into account, and I figured I'm safe. And my assessment was correct. I mean, I do get to keep my pawn, which is the most important thing, because the queens have been traded off. Obviously, if the pieces get traded off, I'm just going to create a passed pawn and make a queen. So here, he went knight f6, which is a tricky move. He could again go for h6, and bishop h4, and g5, and bishop g3, and bishop a6, which I thought was a better continuation, with still the same ideas to follow knight b4 and stuff. But he went knight f6, and this forces me to give up my bishop. If I don't give up my bishop, if I, for example, go knight bd2, then knight d5, and I'm in trouble. Or if I castle, then knight e4, and again, I'm in trouble. So after knight f6, I just took. Bishop takes and castles. He went knight b4, the knight cannot be taken because I lose a rook, so rook c1. Bishop a6, this is a good move. Trades off his passive piece and puts the rook on a6, which is a good idea because a2 is now a weakness, so I took. He took. And here I thought for a long time. So I'm a pawn up. His pieces are obviously more active. He has a lead in development. But if I manage to untangle, then I'm going to have a great position of pawn up. I need two moves. If I could play two moves, I'm perfectly safe. Okay, so what's the problem? Is he threatening to win a pawn? Well, for the moment he is, but after my next move, all of his threats are gone. I thought for a long time and played knight d4. Now, whether he can take the pawn or not wasn't hard to calculate. He cannot take the pawn. If he takes with the rook, then simply rook takes, knight takes, and rook c2. That wins a piece, so that's easy. And if he takes with the knight, this is also quite easy. I go rook c2, he goes knight b4, I take, he takes, and I go rook a2, and I win my material with interest. So, for example, knight c7 and rook a7. This again should be a close to winning position for white because I have a passed pawn on b3. And I'm fully developed now. So after knight d4, it wasn't whether he can take the pawn or not. He cannot take the pawn. It was all the other stuff after rook c8, which he did play. So now, firstly, I go a4, defending my pawn. I cannot unpin yet. And he goes rook b6. Again, this knight is immune now because of the rook and because of the other rook. And here I made a mistake. So what I have to do here is simply start unpinning. So rook d1 is probably the best move. And if bishop d4, then e d4. If knight d5, then c4. So that was quite a good variation. I don't see what he can do against this because now I am threatening to take the knight. Of course, this is not a pin anymore because there's a knight on d4. So he has to either take on d4 or move the knight. Whichever one he chooses, I have a good position. The other option was rook a3, which defends my b3 pawn. And now again, the knight is not attacked because the rook is hanging, but he can go knight d3 anyway, which should be the trickiest move. And after rook d1, knight b2, I can simply retreat my rook. For example, rook f1, because now the b3 pawn has been defended. Instead, I went for a move which I thought was good, but it actually doesn't work. And there's a subtle reason why it doesn't work. I went knight a3. Knight a3 now actually enables me to move my d4 knight and trade my a1 rook for 2 pieces if he's not careful. So if I'm given 2 moves, for example, knight b5 and cb and bishop a1 and rook a1. So he went knight d3, which obviously is the critical move. Attacking the c3 pawn, attacking the b3 pawn, threatening bishop takes d4 and knight takes c1. My calculation was rook to d1. Okay, fine, what's wrong with this? And in the game, what I'd calculated actually happened, and I got a completely winning endgame. This is what happened. Bishop takes d4, rook takes d3, bishop takes c3, and rook c1. And his bishop is attacked. He has to either move it and lose a rook, or defend it with rook bc6. That's the only move. And now simply rook takes d7. Again, this bishop has no good discoveries, because if it attacks the knight, then I can trade. So bishop b4, and trade, and knight c4. This is what happened in the game, and this is just overwhelming. My knight is never getting dislodged. He has more weaknesses than I do. There was a problem, however, after rook d1. After rook d1, he could have just taken on c3, which I didn't think was good. I was going to play knight a b5, attacking the rook. But here's the issue. Bishop d4, e d4, and simply rook b3. And I thought this was a good position. It's not a good position. After knight a7, if anybody is better, it's black. So I have a passed pawn, but that doesn't mean much. Fortunately for me, he didn't see it, so we went into this variation. Okay, so after knight c4, he played bishop c5, defending on a7, g3. I need to get some luft and get my king into play. So we brought our kings into play. He played h5, I played h4, not allowing him to gain space. And here he played rook c8. And I can try to win straight away, and the variation which I chose actually works. Or I can hold on. The problem in this position for him is that he is actually in a sort of Zugzwang. It's very hard to find moves. I don't know what to suggest for him. Basically, I'm threatening b4, and once the bishop moves away, I'm going to take on a7. And first gain a tempo on the rook. Or if the bishop goes to b6, I'm going to trade everything off. So he plays rook c8, sort of a waiting move. I went b4. He plays the only move, bishop d4. Now taking straight away was probably best. But I calculated something a bit more complicated, which did work. But I almost managed to mess it up. Or I did manage to mess it up, but he didn't use it. Okay, so knight d2, again attacking the bishop. Bishop c3, the only move. Knight e4, again attacking the bishop. And now if the bishop moves away, I win a clean pawn. And That I mean, the bishop moves, I take on a7 and make 2 queens. But there's a very tricky positional move here, a5. And he found it. I saw it when I was calculating, and I found a way to deal with it. My continuation had a slight flaw, though. So obviously now he's threatening bishop b4. He's also threatening a b4. May be able to draw that. So knight c3. Rook c3, ba5, rook c4. This is all forced. And in this position, I blundered. So this is a winning rook and pawn endgame. He's going to win one of your pawns. But that doesn't really matter. If you want, you can pause the video here. It's a very complex position. Should be a win, but it's very complex. So the way to win this position is to actually go a6 first, and not get your rook in front of the pawn with those patterns of rook g7, rook g8, rook h8, rook f8. But after rook a4, you simply go a7. And now the point is, if the king ever moves away from the defense of e7, with, for example, king d6, you can just start marching your king towards his rook. So king d1, rook a2, king c1. If the king ever approaches, you can take the pawn. So if he pushes the pawn, then you can start mopping up, or you can just move this rook away. Obviously, if the rook ever goes away from the a file, then you can queen. So once the rook waits, then you start picking off pawns. And you should be able to win this position. And I saw that, but I thought what I did was stronger. It wasn't stronger. It led to an almost drawn position. I went rook a7. Rook a4, a6, king d6, rook a8, king e6. And now he has to be careful, obviously. If this e7 pawn wasn't here, then it's a much easier win because I can just go a7, and the king would have to stay on these two squares. Otherwise, the patterns with winning the rook. And I would just be able to march my king towards his rook and win. But I played a7 here. And after a7, this is not winning, because he can always block my king in. So let me show you. He plays king f7, for example. I start moving towards his king. I don't know, king g7. Here, he waits. Here, he waits. Here, he waits. And the point is, I have to somehow get my king into e6. But he can always prevent me. He just waits. And how do I make progress? Whenever I get to d7, he can just check me away. This should be a draw, which I didn't assess correctly. So I think I played well throughout the game, but then I made a mistake in a basic endgame, and he could have punished me. Fortunately for me, he didn't punish me. He went f5, which f5 is, I think he thought it was a draw. But I should mention this is move 39. So on move 40, you get an additional 30 minutes. We were both very short on time for the last 5 or 10 moves. He went f5, and now it's over. You just switch plans, rook g8. You win 2 pawns. He has to take on a7, rook a7, rook g6, king f7, rook g5, and this is very, very basic. This you basically cannot mess up. So e6, rook h5, king g6, rook h8. I'll just show you how I converted. So the plan is to go f3. He helped me by playing e4. I went f3. King e6, fe4. It was way more resilient to take with the f pawn and give me 2 passed pawns, even though that's also losing. He took with the rook, and now it's even simpler. King f3, king e5, and rook d4. He has no choice but to trade rooks. There is no way to decline. So takes, king f4, and here my opponent resigned. Obviously, I have 2 passed pawns. But coming back to the critical position here, not going for the simpler plan, because I'm used to this pattern of having my rook in front of the pawn, I just thought, okay, I'm going to win that endgame. That's going to be simpler. But this is a pattern I'm not familiar with. I found it during the game, but I actually have never seen it before. Just putting your pawn on the 7th rank with your rook next to it and just marching your king up the board. This was much simpler. Yeah, okay, I should have found it. Anyway, it was perhaps an undeserved win. I would actually call it that. He should have drawn. Hopefully he learned from this and he will be able to draw similar positions. I definitely have learned from this and I'm not going to be messing up similar positions anytime soon. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.